Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. This series is on critical thinking skills in science. What we're looking at is what is critical thinking skills, what is science, and the application for today. This is chapter 6, and we're going over knowledge and wisdom, because critical thinking has to do with ascertaining or arriving at reliable knowledge, or protecting reliable knowledge that is already in place. So what we're looking at in this series, this chapter, is what is knowledge, or what is knowledge and wisdom. So this is video number 1, session number 1 of chapter 6. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you'd like to communicate with us, you can do so through the addresses that are on the board. Knowledge and wisdom from a Western perspective. This is what the whole class, what we've been going over, is that there are different perspectives, and different perspectives even influence education, influence academics, influence science itself. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking is the ongoing search for valid, reliable knowledge to guide beliefs, decisions, and actions. Okay, so what is critical thinking? One definition is critical thinking is the ongoing search for valid and reliable knowledge to guide beliefs, decisions, and actions. Now, with this definition, reliable knowledge, from my perspective, is also built upon beliefs. So it's not just a core of knowledge to guide in beliefs, but it's a core of knowledge that has been built on beliefs. There are several shades of definitions for critical thinking, and that's what we're going to get into a little bit later. Different session, but another definition or amplified definition of critical thinking is the process of assessing reasons to evaluate statements, assumptions, and arguments in ordinary situations. The goal of this process is to help us have good beliefs, where good means that our beliefs meet certain goals of thought, such as truth, usefulness, or rationality. Now, this is a kind of an interesting definition, and it ends with kind of an interesting part. Is means that our beliefs meet certain goals of thought, such as truth, usefulness, or rationality, not and rationality. So it's kind of like rationality is the pin in critical reasoning. So what we have is there's truth. You might say you have truth. It might be very useful, but if it is not reasonable based on human reasoning, then it is not a valid, it is not a good goal of critical thinking. So critical thinking's main goal is rationality in arriving at reliable knowledge that is built off of human reasoning. Here we got the house diagram again, which shows us where we're at. Now, if you'll notice in the house diagram, we're talking about a Western perspective on critical thinking. And critical thinking is based out of philosophy and is run by the rules of philosophy. So we have to look at philosophy to be able to understand where are we at in Western critical thinking. Now, this should be a comparison, because in a previous chapter, we built our own philosophy. We built our own house. And so now we're looking at this house and how it functions and comparing the houses, and to see how your belief maybe your definition of even critical thinking might be a little different because of your house. Is your house the same as this one, or is it different? And if it is different, in what ways is it different? Now, my house is different than this one, but this is the Western house of which today's critical thinking is based out of. And if you'll notice that it starts with epistemology, it does not start with culture. And so as the Western thought was building, it was building a universal knowledge. It wanted to build a universal type of thinking that would be applied to every culture. And so when we're talking about critical thinking, Western thought is that critical thinking is the same for everybody and for every culture. Therefore, culture is not included as a factor in building this house. It starts right off with epistemology. Epistemology is our primary source of reliable knowledge. And what is our primary source of reliable knowledge? Well, if we're talking about what is the goal of critical thinking, then you probably already have an idea of what is the reliable source of knowledge. What would be the nominated reliable source of knowledge? In his book, The Story of Philosophy, Brian McGee comments on the foundational choice of the early philosophers. And they were early philosophers, Ionian and Greek, that did a major paradigm shift in their time, which went against their cultural norms, went against what their culture had established as being the way to do things. He says, Brian McGee says in his book, he says, the first philosophers were making two great breaks with the past simultaneously. In the first place, they were trying to understand the world by use of their reason, without appealing to religion or revelation or authority or tradition. Now, this was a real break from the past, because almost all the cultures up to that time were I would say, more of a non-Western type of culture. They were very community. They were very submissive to external authorities. They looked to external authorities. They looked to tradition, how they always have done it. And so for these philosophers to say, we're rejecting religion, the religion of the forefathers of the culture, we're rejecting revelation, which would be what was revealed through the prophets, or authority, or tradition. So in other words, what are these philosophers advocating? What are they saying is the source of reliable knowledge? It's no longer authority, it's no longer tradition, it's no longer revelation, it's no longer, so what is it? Well, this is what we've been talking about in other series, other chapters, is that critical thinking is the process of using and assessing reasons to evaluate statements. Okay, so we're implementing reason. And you think, well, that's reasonable to implement reason in critical thinking. Well, what that does then, it chooses and eliminates the other sources of reliable knowledge. So if you have built your house and you're saying, I want to build it off of intuition, intuition is not reason. If you're saying, well, I want to build it off an external authority, what is your house built off of? What did you choose to how to build your house? What this one is built off, critical reasoning is built off of, or critical thinking, is off of number 3, which is reason. And not number 4, empiricism. It goes straight for the thinking, because we're talking about thinking. We're talking about analyzing. We're talking about looking at things and analyzing them, taking them apart. So the goal is to produce and protect reliable knowledge. So critical thinking not only produces reliable knowledge, but it's to protect reliable knowledge that has been already put together and accepted as the social norms. And that's what we're going to look at a little farther on, is that the founder, father of critical thinking, Socrates, he's accredited with being the father of it, went against all social norms of his day to found and to establish what is today known as critical thinking. So it's kind of, at one time then, to be a critical thinker is to go against all the norms, to establish it. But once it was established, then it was to protect the norms. Reliable knowledge is knowledge that has a high probability of being true because its veracity has been justified by a reliable method. Reliable knowledge is sometimes called justified true belief. To distinguish reliable knowledge from belief that is false and unjustified, or even true but unjustified. Okay, so critical thinking here is, or reliable knowledge, what is reliable knowledge? That's what this session is about. What is knowledge? What is reliable knowledge? Reliable knowledge, then, is knowledge that has a high probability of being true. It's not claiming truth. It's claiming a high probability because it's still human-centered. And it is still, in other words, governed by skepticism, which says, well, we don't have a knowledge of everything to be able to know if this is true and that is false. But with what knowledge we have and how we've tested it through our methods, it has a high probability of being true. Reliable knowledge is sometimes called justified true belief. Okay, so when you get reliable knowledge, what you really have arrived at is a belief. You believe that this is true because you've justified it through a reliable method. So what is your reliable method of getting to reliable knowledge? And so this is kind of a circular where we have to, we claim to have reliable knowledge because it was produced by a reliable method. But if you don't have confidence in that method, you're saying, well, I do not believe that method produces 100% reliable knowledge, then my certainty of truth would be lower. So in other words, whatever is produced by the reliable method, whatever is produced through critical thinking by that reliable method, it is not necessarily truth. It is a belief that has been justified. And that is to distinguish reliable knowledge from belief that is false. And what beliefs would be false? Well, a false belief then would be something produced by a different source of reliable knowledge. So in other words, it would be produced by intuition. That would be reliable knowledge that is false, or it would be considered false by the method of reasoning, human reason, or external authority. That would be considered false knowledge because it is not based on human reasoning. It's based and accepted on an external authority. So to distinguish reliable knowledge from belief that is false and unjustified, or even true but unjustified. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the belief is even true if you can't justify it. And how do you justify it? Well, in this way, it has to be justified through observation. It has to be justified through hypothesis. It has to be justified through experiment. So in other words, it has to be able to be submitted to human reasoning and human observation through the scientific method. That's the only method that is acceptable that can produce reliable knowledge. So in other words, how does that fit into the house or the philosophy that you have put together and that you say, this is what I believe will get me to reliable belief. And I justify that belief because of my source of reliable knowledge. See, it's kind of, we have to be careful and we have to understand. That's why it is important that we develop our own philosophy, our own belief system, so that we can understand and say, no, wait a minute, I believe differently than this. My house is different. And so I would not come to the same conclusions. And reliable knowledge, meaning really reliable beliefs or unjustified beliefs, then I have different beliefs. Or do I? Are my beliefs the same as the house that produced this, or is it different? What does your house look like? What does my house look like? So we can have false, unjustified beliefs, or we can even have true but unjustified beliefs. And so that would be anybody whose belief has been produced by a source, a reliable knowledge, other than human reason. So that would be intuition, especially intuition and external authority. Those two would be the ones most suspect of producing either false beliefs, unjustified, or maybe even true beliefs, but they are unjustified. So it doesn't matter if they're true. That doesn't matter. If you can't justify them, then they're still discarded. Science and knowledge. There are other methods of discovering and learning knowledge about nature. But science is the only method, that would be the scientific method, that results in the acquisition of reliable knowledge. That is from a university in the UK. That was their definition, is that there are various sources of knowledge. And we're talking about critical thinking, which is to produce and discern reliable knowledge. And what they're saying is that science and knowledge, there are other methods. There are other methods. You can use whatever method you want, but there's only one that produces reliable knowledge. But science is the only method that results in the acquisition of reliable knowledge. Okay, so it's kind of narrowed down by the belief system. The belief system says, nope, the scientific method is the only method that can and will produce reliable knowledge. So this is what we're bringing to, okay, what is that method? What specifically is the scientific method? Well, the scientific method is a little vague, but it has central components to it. The scientific method is the process of objectively establishing facts through testing and experimentation. Okay, in that definition right there, maybe you can spot two things in comparison to Stephen Jay Gould's quote of where he was talking about facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Okay, so even using reason, Stephen Jay Gould is saying the facts aren't objective. There is no object, meaning a one-to-one correspondence, meaning that what I see is what there is. Stephen Jay Gould, as well as myself, believe that there is not a one-to-one correspondence, and I do not have direct access to those objects. When I am looking at the object, I am looking at it through my perspective, and it may be really close, but somebody else might be looking at it from their perspective and see it differently. Kind of like a police report. You have different eyewitnesses of something that happened, and many times those accounts aren't exactly lined up as perfectly. And actually, it's been stated that if there are eyewitness accounts that line up perfectly all the way around, then they would almost suspect that there's been some collaboration or some meeting together about what happened, because even the police expect a difference in perspective and of eyewitness accounts. So the scientific method is the process of objectively. Okay, that might be the first flag in that. In my perspective, I don't believe we can get to things objectively without the subjective interpretation process of it. So through establishing facts. Okay, facts again are someone's interpretation. There might be a consensus on it that this is a fact because we have a consensus on it. And it's kind of like, well, a fact is interpreted data, interpreted evidence. And it may be right on, it may be perfect, may be true, but as Stephen Jay Gould says, is that even the facts, there's nothing that comes to us as objective facts. There are objects that are subjectively interpreted, and that's why we have different scientists, we have different approaches, we have different interpretations. Through testing and experimentation, the basic process involves an observation, forming a hypothesis, making a prediction, conducting an experiment, and analyzing the results. Then the process is repeated. Okay, so that is basically the scientific method. And whether you put hypothesis first to test the hypothesis, and then make an experiment, and then the experiment you evaluate the observation, the experiment, you see whether or not the hypothesis needs to be adjusted, and you resubmit it again to experimentation. So the scientific method basically are those three phases, which is rationalism, which is the hypothesis making. Then it's got the empiricism, which is the observation, which is the experiment itself. And then you have skepticism, which is analyzing the results and looking at it and readjusting things, and then submitting it back again to testing. So that is what is the scientific method. And that is the only method that is accepted as the method that can produce reliable knowledge. Now, what we're looking at is that if that is the only method, and yet there's scientists that say objectivity is not neutral, is that the object, we do not as subjects see the same object in the same light. We're seeing it through our prism, we're seeing it through our worldview, we're seeing it through our theory, and which is theory, habit, prejudice, and culture. So again, what they say is the only method that results in reliable knowledge is the scientific method. And I could say the scientific method has been very valuable, and it is very useful. It promotes critical thinking, but I would not say the scientific method can define all of reality. And as man, as a discerner of truth, I believe that there are some problems with that. Just because of my perspective of the human race, my perspective of origins, where they came from, and what has happened since the origin. Back to the quote, and this is where, okay, we're looking at the previous quote that talked about objectively looking at the facts. Objectively. So now we come back to Stephen Jay Gould, and his quote is, "First, facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people." Okay, that's why this quote, we look at this quote now from different perspectives, and when we're getting different, like I said, perspectives on it, critical thinking now, we're looking at critical thinking. Critical thinking says that there is, in science, that there's only one way to critical think. There's only one way to get reliable knowledge, and that is through the scientific method. But yet we have a scientist here that is, and then they say, so looking at objectively, objects objectively, and those generate facts just that are neutral. And Stephen Jay Gould, who is a scientist, he says, wait a minute, first facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. I can be reasonable and still see things differently, but I would not be reasonable according to how reason might be defined by the scientific method, because the scientific method says you can only use human reason, and I do not. I use external authority. I use what God has revealed, and I put a higher value on the truth of what God knows versus the truth of what I know. And that's why Manna says it's not truth, really. It's justified belief. And so it's kind of like, okay, I think mine is justified also. I think my belief is justified. It's justified because of the source. And the source is the highest source that there exists, the source that created all that exists, the source of all knowledge and the source of all truth. That's a pretty high justification by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. Okay, so there are so many facts out there, or so much data out there, we have to choose what data, what facts we want to look at. And what determines our choices? What determines our choices is data and facts that more cleanly fit our paradigm. So in other words, that don't make trouble for us to interpret. And so we just push away those things that maybe don't support our theories. And so we only look at certain things. And that's why at times if you want to engage to somebody that has a different perspective and you offer them your facts, you offer them that, and they might just brush them off because there's so many facts and data out there that they choose the ones that are easier to support their paradigm. So it's kind of like it can be frustrating. You're saying, well, if they would just look, if they would just see, and it's kind of like it doesn't happen that way. In that we choose influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. So maybe then they will choose to see the facts that we offer them, but they'll perceive them in a different way. They'll perceive them in a way that their theory and their paradigm shapes their vision of those facts. This series is on critical thinking. We're on chapter 6, which is the knowledge and wisdom, and defining knowledge, defining wisdom, and that is the goal of critical thinking. So what we're trying to do in this series, this chapter, is defining knowledge and what defines it. What are the parameters for it? And what we're looking at now is critical thinking, and that it produces a reliable knowledge in a way that's called a justified belief. So we're all believers. It's just that some belief they accept as being justified, and other beliefs are not justified. And so if they're not justified, then they are not accepted. Whether they're true or not, they're not accepted because they do not fit the model of justification. How was it justified? And how is critical thinking knowledge justified? It's justified through the scientific method. And that is the only method that's allowable to produce justified knowledge, justified beliefs, true beliefs. We're Tim and Holly. You're welcome to communicate to us through the addresses that are here on the board. This is we're in the series of critical thinking and skills in science. We're in chapter 6, which is on knowledge. This is session number 1. Thank you for joining us.